I am 63 years old, sitting in a Corolla behind a Waffle House at 2 in the morning, trying to figure out how a man sleeps in his car without looking like a man who is sleeping in his car. 11 hours earlier, my son stood in his own doorway and told me the guest room was taken this weekend. The people staying in it live less than 20 minutes from his house. They had never spent a single night there before. I had $14 and some change. And at 9:40 the next morning, my phone rang. A number out of Greenville County that I had never seen before. A man on the other end told me his boss wanted 1 hour of my time, and that they would pay me $600 for that 1 hour. I had no idea who that man was. Not until I walked into his house. I am going to tell you all of it, including the part where the money turned out to be the least important thing in the whole story, and the part I am still not sure I handled right, even now. My name is Ellis Crenshaw. I'm 65 now. I'm from Greenville, South Carolina, and I've lived within 9 miles of the same intersection my entire life. For 34 years I ran a crane and rigging outfit. Crenshaw Rigging started with one boom truck and a set of slings I bought used off a man in Anderson in 1990. At the top of it, 11 people, 4 machines, and a shop out toward Piedmont. We set steel. We set HVAC units on hospital roofs. We did the tricky ones nobody else wanted to bid. And that trade taught me exactly one thing that runs through this entire story, so bear with me for 60 seconds because it's going to matter at the end. It's called the sling angle. Say you've got a 2-ton load and 2 straps going up to a hook. If those straps come up steep close to vertical, each leg is carrying about a ton. Simple. That's what people expect. But as that angle gets shallower, as the straps spread out wider and flatter, the tension in each leg multiplies. Fast. At 30 degrees, each of those legs is carrying 2 tons, not 1. Get down near 15 and you're pulling 4 times the weight of the load. And here's the part I put on a card and made every hand in my shop memorize. The load never changed. The angle did. That's how people get killed in my business. Not because something got heavier. Because the geometry changed and nobody recalculated. 34 years I taught that. And I'll be damned if I ever once applied it to my own family. Verna was my wife for 31 years. She died 11 years ago, ovarian, found late, the way it usually is. She taught 4th grade at the same school for 19 years. There are grown men in this county who still call her Ms. Crenshaw when they see her picture. We had one boy, Grady. He's 38 now. And I need to tell you how the company went down, quickly, because it explains what I showed up on that porch with. We got sued over a job in 2022. A tilt-up panel we set came out of plumb months later. The slab under it had a sub-base problem. Nobody caught. Not us. Not the geotech. Not the GC. And when the cracking showed up, the owner sued everybody whose name was on a document. And my insurance carrier found a hole in my policy language you could have driven a truck through. Denied. 18 months of legal fees, and then a judgment. 34 years, 4 machines, 11 people, and a business phone number I'd had since 1990. The bank did not care about a perfect payment history going back to the first Bush administration. Numbers on a screen don't have a memory. I sold the equipment at auction, and it brought less than half of what it should have, because everybody in that room knew exactly why it was being sold. And after the judgment, and the lawyers, and the last 2 payrolls I made sure went out because I did make those payrolls, and I'd do it again. I had about $9,000, and a Corolla I'd bought for my wife in 2013. I rented a room out on Wade Hampton for 4 months. Then that ran out. And that's how I ended up on my son's front porch on a Tuesday afternoon in October with 1 bag. Grady lives in a nice place off Pelham Road. Brick, 2-story, the kind of house I used to drive past when he was 6 and think someday. I called ahead. I want to be clear about that. I called Sunday and told him I'd be by Tuesday and what I needed to ask. He opened the door and said, "Dad, hey, I thought you were coming this weekend," which he knew wasn't right. He knew it as it came out of his mouth. And I said, "Plans moved. Is this a bad time?" And before he answered, Larissa came up behind him. My daughter-in-law and I had never been close, but she'd always been polite. That afternoon, the look on her face was something else entirely. Not dislike, closer to alarm. The look of somebody watching a thing arrive that they have specifically been dreading. She said, "Ellis." And my name came out of her the way you'd read an unwelcome item off a list. She said, "Grady told me what's going on." and I moved my bag to the other hand. I noticed myself doing that, moving the bag like I was hiding it, and I said I was hoping to stay a few days, just till I get something lined up. I won't be underfoot. And she folded her arms, and I watched my son's whole posture change. It was immediate. I'd seen it before at holidays and never let myself name it. He read her the way you read a sky before you decide whether to send men up. And she said, "The thing is, we've got the Ainsworths coming to stay this weekend, and you know how small that room is." And I stood there, because the Ainsworths live on Roper Mountain Road, 14 minutes away. They have never in their lives spent a night in that house, and both of us knew it, and neither of us said it. And I looked at my son. I want to describe this properly, because it's the thing I go back to. I looked at him and I waited, not long, maybe 3 seconds. I was waiting for him to say anything at all, even hang on, let me think about this, even Dad, can we talk in the driveway? And he looked at the door frame, at the frame, about 8 inches to the left of my head. And he said, "There's a motel out by the interstate. Might be something temporary till you get sorted. Till you get sorted." And something came apart in me right there that had nothing to do with money or a house. Because that was the boy I taught to ride a bike on Ashmore Bridge Road. That was the kid who came to job sites in a hard hat I bought him at a supply house for $4. That was the man I put through Clemson on a rigging contractor's income. And I want to be honest, I took on debt to do it and I never once mentioned it to him. I said, "I see." And Larissa's face softened right then, the second she knew she'd won into something that looked a lot like sympathy. She said, "It's not that we don't want to help, Ellis. It's just that this is a lot for everybody right now. Grady's under it at work, and my mother's health hasn't been good. We honestly don't have the capacity for it." Capacity? I have thought about that word about 4,000 times since. Capacity is a rigging term. Everything I ever picked up had a rated capacity. The sling, the shackle, the hook, the machine, and you never ever exceed it. I just never expected to hear my own family use it about me. And I said, "Of course, I understand," which was a lie. I did not understand. I did not understand how the same woman who called me in 2019 to move a sectional, and again in 2021 to sit with their dog for 9 days while they were in Charleston, had run the numbers on 3 nights and come back over capacity. Grady said, "There's a place off Lawrence Road, 89 a night, I think." I'd already looked. I'd looked in the car before I came to the door, because I'm not a fool, I just hoped I was wrong. 3 nights would have taken most of what I had. And I said, "That sounds fine." And Larissa brightened, immediately. The way people do when an uncomfortable thing resolves in their favor. She said, "And once you're settled somewhere, we'd love to have you for dinner, maybe in a few weeks." A few weeks. When the inconvenience of me could be contained to 90 minutes and a casserole, I hugged my son goodbye on that porch. And he held on about a second and a half longer than he needed to. And for that second and a half, I genuinely thought he was going to change it. I thought he was going to say, "No, come in, we'll figure it out." He patted my back twice and said, "Take care of yourself, Dad." And I walked down that driveway and heard the door shut behind me with a soft click. And I sat in that car for a few minutes looking at the flower beds she keeps like a magazine. If you have ever stood on a porch and waited 3 seconds for somebody to say one word on your behalf and watched them look at the doorframe instead, you already know. That's not anger. It's a specific kind of falling. The porch is still under you, and you're going down through it anyway. The motel off Lawrence was full. So was the next one. There was some kind of trade show in town, I found that out later, and everything from the interstate to downtown was booked solid. By 9 that night, I was parked behind a Waffle House off Woodruff, with the seat reclined about 11 degrees, which is as far as it goes in a Corolla, working out the logistics of sleeping in a car with dignity. I never did figure that out. And I laughed, once, out loud, alone in that lot, because I spent 34 years lifting the pieces of other people's buildings into place and I couldn't find a room. I slept maybe 2 hours. Every time I got close, headlights would come across the windshield. My phone rang at 9:40 the next morning. I almost let it go. Number I didn't know, and after the previous day I did not want to talk to one more human being. But desperation makes you answer things. Man's voice. Formal. Very precise. "Mr. Crenshaw, my name is Sebastian Odom. I manage the household affairs for Mr. Thaddeus Rourke. He would like very much to meet with you this morning, if you're available." And I said, "I'm sorry, who?" "Thaddeus Rourke. He's asked for a meeting at 11. I'm afraid it's somewhat urgent. And that name meant nothing to me. In 34 years of construction, you meet 1,000 people, and Rourke wasn't ringing anything. I said, I think you want a different Ellis Crenshaw. There was a pause, and paper moving. And he said, Ellis Wade Crenshaw, born the 8th of June, 1960, formerly of Crenshaw Rigging, out of Piedmont. And my stomach did something. I said, how do you know that? And he said, Mr. Rourke has been quite specific. He isn't in good health, and time is a factor. And I sat in a car in a parking lot with $14 and looked at a dumpster. And I said, what does he want? He said, I'm not able to discuss it by phone, but I'm authorized to compensate you for your time. Would $600 be acceptable for 1 hour? $600. I want to be honest about this because it's the least flattering sentence in this whole story. I did not think about whether it was legitimate. I did not think about whether it was safe. I thought about $600 and a shower and 3 nights indoors. I said where? The address came through a minute later, out past Cleveland Park, up in the part of town where the driveways are longer than the streets I grew up on. I cleaned up as well as a man can in a Waffle House bathroom. Cold water, hands through the hair, tucked my shirt in twice. The man in that mirror looked 70. That gate had ironwork in it and opened before I said a word into the box. The drive up went a quarter mile through oaks that were there before the Civil War, and the house at the end of it was not a house. It was a building. I parked a 2013 Corolla between a Range Rover and something German and low, and I want to tell you I didn't care. I cared. I sat there 4 seconds before I got out. Sebastian Odom met me at the door. Tall, thin, 60-something, in a suit that cost more than my car. Handshake firm and short. He walked me through rooms with rugs in them I was afraid to step on, and into a study at the back. Thaddeus Rourke was in a wheelchair behind a desk. And Odom had not been exaggerating. That man was thin to the point of transparency, skin like paper, hands that looked like something you'd find on a beach. But the eyes were completely alive, sharp, and they went over me like a man reading a load chart. He said, Ellis Crenshaw, sit down. I sat. My boots looked ridiculous on that rug. He said, you're wondering why you're here. I said the thought had crossed my mind. And he smiled. And something moved behind his face recognition, and something sadder underneath it, and it was gone before I could name it. And he said, tell me, do you remember a night on Highway 25, coming down off the mountain toward Traveler's Rest? February, 8 years ago, raining hard enough you couldn't see the lines, and everything in me went cold, because I hadn't thought about that night in years. I had specifically not thought about it. And I said, how do you know about that? And Thaddeus Rourke folded those hands on the desk. And he said, because I was in the other car. Now, I want to slow down here, because this is the part that took the floor out. I'd been coming home from a job in Brevard. 14-hour day. We'd been setting rooftop units and lost most of the morning to wind, and I was running on gas station coffee. It had been raining since about 4 in the afternoon, and it had not let up once. And I came around a bend and there were headlights in my lane. A sedan, sideways, hydroplaning, coming at me at maybe 50. And I had about a second and a half. And I cut the wheel right. That's not a decision. I want to be clear. Nobody decides that in a second and a half. That's 30 years of muscle memory saying don't be where the thing is. My truck went into the guardrail and through it. Rourke said, you could have held your lane. It would have been head on, and you'd have been in the better vehicle. And I said I didn't think about it. And he said, I know. That's rather the point. His car had gone through the rail ahead of mine and down about 18 feet into the creek. Mine caught on the rail and stopped, half over. And I sat there for a few seconds figuring out whether anything on me was broken. And then I heard the water. Rourke said, you came down that bank. And I remembered it then, all at once, the way you remember things you filed. The bank was mud and briars, and I went down most of it on my back, tore my jacket wide open. His car was on its side in about 3 feet of water, and the water was going in through a window. The door wouldn't move. I tried it twice. And I got a rock out of the creek bed, and I broke the back glass and went in through there. And I got him out. He was dead weight, and it took everything I had, and my hands were opened up from the glass, and I got him up that bank about 8 feet at a time. He was bleeding from his scalp, and he was not conscious. And the EMS came, and I rode with him because at that point I wasn't leaving him, and I stayed at the hospital until his wife got there at 2 in the morning, and then I went home. And I never once contacted him after that. Rourke asked me about that. He said, "Why didn't you ever call? Or come by?" And I sat there and tried to say it right. I said, "It wasn't my business. You were alive. That's the part that mattered. You had a life to go back to and I had one, and there wasn't anything else to say." And he looked at me for a long moment. And then he said, "Do you know what I was doing on that road at that hour? In that weather?" I said no. And he said, "I was leaving. My wife, my company, all of it. I'd found out that morning that a regulatory matter I'd been managing was going to become a criminal matter. I was driving to Charlotte to get on an airplane. The clock on that mantel was the loudest thing in the room." He said, "That accident put me in a bed for 6 weeks, and in 6 weeks my attorneys found a way through it that I would never have found running. The matter resolved. I stayed. And everything I built after that, I built because a man I'd never met came down a muddy bank in February." And then he said, "3 cars went past before you got there. That's in the trooper's report. 3 sets of headlights saw a car in the creek and kept going. I hadn't known that." I sat with it for a second. And then Rourke said, "Ellis, I'm dying. Pancreatic. They've given me weeks, and they've been generous about it twice already." And he pulled a folder across that desk. And he said, "I've made arrangements. And I need you to hear the whole shape of them before you say anything. Now here's where I have to be careful, because the version of this that people expect is not what happened. He did not hand me a check for $800 million. That's a fairy tale and I'd be lying. What he did was more interesting and, honestly, harder. He'd put the operating businesses, a manufacturing concern, 2 logistics companies, a real estate arm into a charitable foundation, irrevocably. Set up over 18 months with a board and a mission and a professional staff. And he'd named me as chairman of that board. And separately, out of his personal holdings, he'd left me an amount of money I'm not going to say out loud on the internet, but I'll tell you it means I will never again wonder about a motel room, and my grandchildren won't either. I looked at that paperwork for a long time, and I said, "Mr. Rourke, I don't know how to run a foundation. I set steel. I've got 2 years of technical college." And he said, "I know exactly what you are. I've had a firm look into you every couple of years for 8 years. And I did not like that. I want to say that plainly. I told him so. And he said, "It was my money and I was deciding where it went. I looked into you. I did not look into your family. I did not look into your neighbors. And there are no recordings of anything, because that would be a crime, and I have quite enough of those behind me." Then he said, "And what I found is a man who paid 2 payrolls out of his own pocket in the last month his company existed, when he was already personally liable, and it did him no good whatsoever." I said that was the job. And he said, "That is precisely why you're sitting there." Then he said the part that I've come back to more than the money. He said, "Do you know what you did after you got me up that bank?" I said I don't remember most of it. He said, "You gave me your jacket." He said, "You were soaked through, in February, with your hands laid open, and you put your jacket over a stranger. And then you sat down in the mud and held my head up out of the water in the ditch until they came. And I did not remember the jacket. To this day I don't." And he said, "I have done business with several thousand people over 41 years. You are the only person I have ever met who did something significant for me and then never once came to collect on it." And I said, "Anybody would have." And Thaddeus Rourke said very quietly, "3 cars, Ellis." Now here's what happened next, and it's the part of this story that actually matters, and it has nothing to do with a will. He asked how I'd ended up in his study at 11 in the morning in a shirt I'd clearly slept in. And I told him. About the judgment, about the auction, about the room on Wade Hampton running out. And I told him about Tuesday afternoon. And he listened to all of it, and then he said one sentence. He said, "Ellis, has it occurred to you that your son may not be able to afford you?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "You said his house is off Pelham. You said his wife keeps the beds like a catalog. May I ask what he does?" "Regional sales, medical supply." And Rourke looked at Odom, who had been standing by the door for 40 minutes without moving. And Odom said carefully, "Mr. Crenshaw, our counsel does title work in 3 counties. Notices of default are published. I'm not going to characterize anything, but a public record is a public record, and it might be worth an hour of your time to look." And that was all he said. And I want to be extremely clear about what did and did not happen here, because this is where a lot of stories go somewhere I won't go. Nobody bugged my son's house. Nobody followed him. Nobody handed me a dossier on my own child. A man told me to go read the legal notices in the newspaper, which anybody in South Carolina can do for free, and which I should have thought of myself. I went to the library that afternoon, the main branch downtown, because I still didn't have a place with internet, and I sat at a public terminal. And I found it in about 9 minutes. Notice of foreclosure sale. My son's address. Filed 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks before I stood on that porch. And I sat at a library terminal in a building where my wife used to take that boy for summer reading, and I put my hand over my mouth. Because everything reorganized itself in about 4 seconds. The Ainsworths weren't a lie about a guest room. The Ainsworths were a lie about a house they were about to lose. If you have ever gotten one piece of information that rearranged a whole month of your life, you know that feeling. It isn't relief and it isn't anger. It's vertigo. Everything you already saw is still there, and it means something completely different now. And then, 2 days later, I got the phone call. I want to tell this exactly. It was a Thursday evening, and I was in a room at a decent hotel that Odom had insisted on, and that I had argued about and lost. My phone rang. Grady. And I let it go 2 rings, and picked it up and said hello. And nobody answered. And there was that particular hollow sound of a phone in a pocket or face down on a counter. He'd called me by accident. He'd hit my name and set it down. And I stood in a hotel room with the phone against my ear for 4 minutes and 11 seconds and listened to my son and his wife have a conversation in their kitchen. Now I've been asked whether I should have hung up. Probably. I'll own that. It was his house, and it wasn't meant for me. I didn't hang up. And I'd like to be able to tell you I agonized about it, and I did not. I stood there and I listened. And here's what I heard, and I'm giving it to you the way it landed. Larissa was saying they'd have to tell his mother's cousin something before the sale notice ran in the paper, because somebody was going to see it. And Grady said something I couldn't fully make out about November. And she said, "We can't have him here. We cannot have your father in this house right now." And Grady said, "I know." And she said, "If he's here when it happens, he'll fix it. That's what he does. He'll find money somewhere and he'll fix it, and then we're that family." And Grady said, and this is the sentence. This is the one he said. "He doesn't have money. He doesn't have anything. That's the whole point. He came here because he doesn't have anything." And she said, "Then it's worse." And there was quiet for a second. And then my son said, "I couldn't tell him. I stood there and I could not tell him." And she said, "I know." And then somebody picked the phone up and the line went dead. I sat down on the end of a hotel bed. And I want to describe what was in my chest, because it was not what I expected, and it is the whole reason I'm telling you any of this. It wasn't rage. It was grief. Enormous. Out of proportion. Sitting on the floor grief. Because I had spent 2 days building a case against my son. I'd been assembling it. And in 4 minutes it came apart. And what was underneath was worse. He hadn't turned me away because he thought I was a failure. He turned me away because he was one, in his own accounting. And he could not stand to have his father in the house while it happened. He would rather I believe he was ashamed of me than have me find out he was drowning. And I know exactly where he learned that. He learned it from a man who ran a rigging company for 34 years, and never told his own wife when a job went bad. Who paid 2 payrolls out of his savings and told nobody, including his son, and then stood on that boy's porch with a suitcase and expected to be read correctly. If you have ever raised somebody, look at what you actually modeled, and not what you said. They will do the modeled thing every time. Every single time. Thaddeus Rourke died on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after I sat in his study. Odom called me while I was eating breakfast. The service was private. I wasn't invited, and that was right. I'd said what I had to say to that man in a study, and I hadn't needed a church for it. The will reading was the following Friday, downtown, in a firm that occupies 3 floors of a building where the furniture is older than my father. I wore a suit that was 6 years old and didn't fit right anymore, and I got there 20 minutes early because that's how I was raised. I wasn't alone in that conference room. Prescott Rourke the son, about 40, sat at one end, looking like a man attending a meeting he'd already priced out. His watch caught the light every time he moved his arm, and I don't think that was accidental. Corinne, the daughter, sat across from him going through her phone with the expression of somebody killing time at an airport. Neither of them acknowledged me. Not a nod. I could have been a chair. The attorney was a man named Josiah Renfro, and he was exactly what you'd cast gray, unhurried, a voice like a church basement. He put 4 folders on that table, and I want to slow all the way down now, because this is the longest 22 minutes in this story and I remember every part of it. He said, "We're here for the reading of the last will and testament of Thaddeus Allen Rourke." And Prescott said, "How much did the changes affect the structure?" He'd already known there were changes. That's a detail I noticed at the time. And Renfro said, "The document executed 3 weeks ago supersedes the prior instrument entirely." Corinne's phone went face down on that table. She said, "Supersedes." And Renfro put on his glasses and started reading in that flat legal voice that drains everything out of everything. And the first section put the whole operating enterprise, everything, all of it, into the Rourke family foundation, irrevocably, effective at death. And Prescott said, "That's not possible." And Renfro kept going, because then there was a paragraph about the son. I'm not going to reproduce it. I'll tell you it was 1 sentence long, and it laid out, in the plainest language, that Prescott had received $111,000 in what were described as advances over 4 years, and that the sum of $100,000 was left to him, and that his father hoped he would use it for the treatment he'd twice agreed to and twice not attended. The room did not make a sound. And then a paragraph about the daughter, same amount, and a line noting the number of times she'd been to that house in 5 years, which was 4, and the purpose of each visit, which was recorded and which I'm not going to repeat because I watched a grown woman's face while it was read and I've decided that's enough. And then Renfro turned a page and said my name. And he read out that the remainder of the personal estate went to Ellis Wade Crenshaw of Greenville County, and that Ellis Wade Crenshaw was appointed chairman of the foundation board for an initial term of 5 years. And I want you to understand what that room was like. It was completely silent for probably 6 seconds. I could hear the air handler. I could hear a keyboard somewhere down the hall. Prescott's chair went back about 4 inches on the carpet. And Corinne said, "Who is that?" Not to me. She said it to Renfro, about me, while I was sitting 11 feet from her. And Renfro said, "According to the documentation, Mr. Crenshaw pulled your father out of a submerged vehicle in February of 2017 and remained with him until his wife arrived at the hospital." And Corinne turned and looked at me for the first time. And she said, "So you did a good deed 8 years ago, and now you think you get our family's money?" And I said quietly, because I did not want to be in a fight in that room. I said, "I didn't know your father's name until 9 days ago. I didn't ask for $1 of this." And I told him no twice in that study. And Prescott said, "Nobody tells a dying man no twice." And I said, "I did, and he told me it wasn't my decision, and I've since learned he was right about that." And then Renfro cleared his throat and handed out 3 envelopes. He said Mr. Rourke had asked that these be opened and read in each other's presence. Mine was 1 page in a shaking hand, and I'm going to give you 2 sentences of it and keep the rest. He'd written, "If you're reading this, my children have just learned that 30 years of indifference finally arrived at a price. They will call you a manipulator. Let them. You did not take anything from them. They set it down repeatedly, over 3 decades, and you happened to be the man who was standing there when I finally noticed the floor." And Prescott opened his and read about 4 lines and stopped. I don't know what was in it. He never read it aloud, and Renfro never made him. He put it back in the envelope and he said, "This is character assassination." And Renfro said, "It's documented. Your father was thorough." And Corinne was crying by then, and I want to be fair, and I don't think all of it was performance. She said, "He humiliated us, in front of a stranger." And I said the only other thing I said in that room. I said, "I don't think he did it to humiliate you." And she said, "Then what?" And I said, "I think he spent his whole life not telling you anything true, and he ran out of time, and this was the only door he had left." And she looked at me like I'd hit her. And in a way I had. And I've thought about whether I should have said it, and I've decided I'd say it again. They left without speaking to me. Neither of them contested it. Odom told me later their attorneys read the medical competency evaluations and the 18 months of foundation documentation and gave them the same advice. Grady called me 4 days later. Word gets around a city this size faster than it should. I still don't know who told him. He said, "Dad, I heard about the Rourke thing. Is it true?" And I said it's true. And he said, "Jesus. Dad, that's And then he stopped. And there was a pause on that line about 2 seconds long. And I want to tell you the truth about what was in his voice, because I braced for calculation, and that is not what I heard. I heard fear. And he said, Are you okay? Where have you been staying? That's the first question either of them had asked me in 2 weeks about me. And then he said, Larissa and I would love to have you for dinner. We feel terrible about how that went. We'd like to make it right. And I said, Let me think about it. I hung up and I sat in a hotel room, and I did not know what I was going to do. I went out to Springwood the next morning and sat by Verna's stone for a while and told her the whole thing out loud like a crazy person. And I asked her what to do, and the wind moved in the oaks, and it didn't say anything because it's wind. But here's what came to me sitting there. Verna would not have gone to that dinner ready to win it. She'd have gone ready to end something, the lying, all of it, hers and theirs and mine. That woman could not abide a room where everybody knew a thing and nobody said it. She'd have rather had 1 bad hour than 2 good years of pretending. So I went. Now the dinner. This is the last long thing, and then I'll get out of your way. I got there at 7 with a bottle of wine that cost $18, because I was curious whether anybody would look at the label. Larissa opened that door and hugged me, held on about 2 seconds too long. The house looked staged, good china out, candles lit, a centerpiece. All of it exactly the effort they had never once made for a regular Sunday when I was just their broke father. And I noticed something in that entryway that I don't think they knew I'd notice. The console table by the door was gone. There'd been a marble-topped thing there for 6 years, and now there was a lamp on the floor where it used to be. They were already selling furniture. Grady came out of the kitchen grinning too wide and said, Dad, come on in. Can I get you a bourbon? I got that one you like. I have never in my life expressed a preference about bourbon. We sat in that front room, and for about 10 minutes nobody said anything real. They kept glancing at each other, that silent traffic that couples run when they've agreed on an approach. Then Larissa leaned forward. She said, Ellis, before anything else, we owe you an apology for that Tuesday. We handled it badly. And Grady said, We were slammed. Her mom's health, my numbers were down. And she said, And honestly, we were trying to protect you. We know how proud you are. We thought if we jumped in and rescued you, you'd feel like a charity case. It was tough love. We believed in you. And I sat there with a glass of water, and I did not say anything for about 4 seconds. Because that was a good story. It was well built. Somebody had worked on it. And it would have worked on me 2 weeks earlier. That's the part that gets me. It absolutely would have worked. And I said, Larissa, can I ask you something? And she said, Of course. I said, What's the date on the foreclosure sale? And I have never heard a room go that quiet. Grady set his glass down on the table without any sound at all. Larissa's face did a thing I'd never seen it do. It went completely blank, like a screen between channels, for about 1.5 seconds while she worked out what I knew and how. And she said, How? And I said, It's a public notice. It runs in the paper. Anybody in this county can look at it for free. And I looked at it 11 days ago at the library downtown. And she said, Grady. And I said, He didn't tell me. Nobody told me anything. That's the whole problem in this room, and it's been the problem for a long time, and I'm going to say my part of it in about 2 minutes, so hang on. And then I looked at my son, and I said, Grady, 2 Thursdays ago you called me by accident and left the line open for 4 minutes. And every bit of color went out of my son's face. He said, Oh God. And I said, I heard what you said about me, and I want to tell you exactly which sentence I heard, because it isn't the one you think. And he said, Dad? And I said, You said. I stood there and I could not tell him. And he put both hands over his face. 38 years old, at his own dining table, with both hands over his face. And Larissa said, You listened to a private. And I said, Yes, I did. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and I should have hung up, and I didn't. And that's mine to carry, and I'm not going to argue about it. And then I said the thing I'd been rehearsing in a truck all afternoon and had gotten wrong 4 times. I said, Son, you didn't turn me away because you thought I was a failure. You turned me away because you thought you were one, and you couldn't stand for me to be in the house to see it. And Grady started crying. I hadn't seen that man cry since his mother's funeral. And I said, And I want you to know where you got that, because you got it from me. And Larissa said, Ellis, and I said, Let me finish, please. I've only got this once. And I said, In 2009, I lost the biggest contract I ever had, and I did not tell your mother for 9 weeks. In the last month of that company, I paid 2 payrolls out of my own savings when I was already personally liable, and I told nobody, including you. And then I drove to your house with a suitcase and expected you to read my mind. I said, I taught you that a man handles it alone and does not say so out loud. You learned it exactly. You learned it better than I did. And nobody said anything for a while. The candles were going. Somebody's dinner was drying out in the oven, and none of us ever ate it. And then I did the thing I'd decided on at the cemetery. I put an envelope on that table. And Grady looked at it and said, Dad, no, absolutely not. That's not why. And I said, it isn't what you think. Open it. Inside was a cashier's check for enough to clear the arrears and stop the sale. Not the house, the arrears. And a single page. And I read the page out loud, because I wanted her to hear it in my voice and not read it later and decide what it meant. It said, this money reinstates the mortgage. It does not buy the house, and it is not a gift toward your lifestyle. It comes with 4 conditions, and if any one of them fails, there is not a second check, not next year, not ever, and I will still love you, and I will still not write it. 1. You sell the second vehicle within 60 days and the proceeds go against the cards. 2. You both sit down with a credit counselor of my choosing, monthly, for 18 months, and I get the summary, not the details. 3. Nobody in this house takes on new debt during those 18 months. Nothing. Not a couch. And 4, and this is the one that matters, and it's not about money. If either of you is ever in trouble again, you tell me inside of 30 days, not when it's finished, not when it's public. 30 days. And I said, that 4th one is the whole thing. The other 3 are bookkeeping. Larissa looked at that paper for a long time. And she said, and her voice was completely different, lower, without any performance in it at all. She said, you don't know what it's like to have somebody's father move in. And I said, no. Tell me. And she told me. Her own daddy went under in 2003. Trucking company. And he moved into her mother's house in Anderson when Larissa was 14, for what everybody said would be a few weeks. He was there 9 years. She watched her mother's entire life get absorbed into managing a man who would not go get a job and would not go get help, and her mother died at 58, and Larissa is completely convinced about why. And she said, so, when you were on that porch with a bag, and she stopped, and I said, I wasn't a man on a porch. I was the opening scene of a movie you'd already watched. And she nodded, and she couldn't say anything else. Now I want to be careful here. That is not an excuse. She invented house guests. She told my son I was over their capacity. She sat in that kitchen and said we cannot have him hear about a man who had nowhere to go. And she has never fully apologized for it, to this day, and I don't expect it anymore. But I understand it. And understanding it costs me nothing, and it is the only reason I get to see my grandchildren, and I would recommend it to anybody. Here's the rest of it, quickly. They made every condition. Everyone. Sold the truck in 5 weeks. Went to that counselor 18 straight months. And Larissa did all the paperwork, and she did it well, because she is extremely capable, and always was. They kept the house. Barely, and with a smaller life in it. Grady called me in April of the following year to tell me he'd been passed over for a promotion, and it was a bad call and he was low, and he made it on day 9. Day 9. I sat in my truck in a parking lot after that call and had to take a minute. Because that's the whole thing. That's the entire 2 years right there. Not the will, not the estate, not the room with the mahogany table. My son called me on day 9. The foundation work turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me, and I did not see that coming at all. I chair a board of 9 people who all know more than I do about everything, which I told them at the first meeting, and one of them said good. Most chairmen don't. We fund trade scholarships now. Rigging, welding, HVAC, diesel, tools and testing fees and first-year dues, because a kid can't start in my trade without about $9,000 he doesn't have. 241 of them so far. I go to the spring thing every year and shake every one of their hands, and it's the best day of my year, and it isn't close. Here's what all this taught me. And it isn't when people show you who they are, believe them, which is what everybody wants it to be, and which I now think is only about half right. Here's the real one. For 34 years I taught men that a load doesn't have to get heavier to kill you. The angle just has to change. Same 2 straps, same 2 tons. Widen the geometry and suddenly each leg is carrying 4 times what anybody calculated, and it fails, and everybody stands around afterwards saying, but it was only 2 tons. That's what happened in my family. I didn't get heavier. I got wider. The suitcase, the timing, the 6 weeks of a foreclosure notice they hadn't told anybody about the geometry changed, and nobody in that house recalculated out loud, and the leg let go on a Tuesday afternoon on a front porch. And the reason nobody recalculated out loud is that I raised a boy who thinks you don't say the number. So here's the specific thing I'd ask you to do, and it costs nothing and it takes 1 text message. Pick the person in your family most likely to hide a bad month from you. You already know who it is. You thought of them before I finished the sentence. Send them this, in whatever words are yours. If it ever goes bad, you have 30 days to tell me. Not when it's fixed, not when it's public. 30 days. That's the only thing I'll ever ask you for. That's it. That's the whole ask. And then this is the hard half. You have to go first the next time it's you. Because they will not believe the rule until they watch you use it. And here's the question I'd want you to sit with tonight. What are you currently not telling the people who love you? And what exactly do you think you're protecting them from? Because I told myself for 30 years that I was protecting Verna and protecting my son. I wasn't protecting anybody. I was managing how I got to be seen, and it cost me a night in a car behind a Waffle House that I did not have to spend. Now I want to hear from you, and I want the honest answer, not the kind one. If you think I did right writing that check and setting those 4 conditions, comment 1. If you think a man who was left to sleep in his car should have kept his money and his distance, and that I rewarded people who'd have let me sit out there indefinitely, comment 2. That argument is real, and I've had it with myself at 4 in the morning more than once. And if you think the actual failure in this whole story is mine, that I spent 30 years teaching my son to never say the number, and then stood on his porch and expected him to say it, comment 3. That's the one I'd pick. That's the one I still turn over. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I read every one of them. There's something about an old rigging hand in South Carolina knowing somebody's hearing this at 6 in the morning half a world away that I can't quite put words to. And if you've ever been turned away by somebody, you'd have crossed a state line for say-so down below. You don't have to give a single detail. Somebody scrolling past tonight is sitting in a car in a parking lot right now doing the math on what's in their wallet, and it would help them to know how this can go. If you want more of these, subscribe and stay with me a while. It's ordinary people, one bad week, and what they turned out to be made of when it came. I'd be glad to have you here. 34 years I told men the same thing every morning before we picked anything up. The load never changes. The angle does. And the angle is the one nobody checks. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Greenville, South Carolina to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.